The record book was found in 1891, hidden under the rotting floorboards of a burned plantation house in southern Georgia. 28 years after the deal was made, the handwriting was still neat and careful. There were 12 names and 12 ages ranging from 4 to 14. There were 12 prices adding up to $8,400. All were sold on December 25th, 1863, but it was the last note that made the county clerk's hands shake. A single word was written in different ink by a shaking hand that barely looked like the earlier writing. Forgive. What the officials found in the days after that Christmas would question every idea about justice, guilt, and the weight of a single night. The master's name was Silas Hargrove, and by morning on December 26th, something had changed him so deeply that those who knew him said he was not the same man anymore. Some said it was punishment from God. Others whispered about something far more scary, something that came for him in the dark of that holy night when the world celebrated peace and he had done an act so cruel that even tough men looked away in disgust. The truth buried in stories, letters, and the broken memories of those who lived is more disturbing than any old legend, because what happened to Silas Hargrove that night was not a ghost story. It was horrifyingly human. And what makes this story even scarier is that every detail can be connected to written records, witness stories, and the physical proof that stayed long after everyone involved had turned to dust. Before we go on with the story of Silas Hargrove and the 12 children whose lives he sold for money on the holiest day of the year, I ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you are listening from. We love knowing where our listeners are. Now, let's find out what really happened on that Christmas night in 1863. The Hargrove plantation sat 7 miles south of Valdosta, Georgia, on land that had been in the family since 1809. By 1863, it was one of the few places in the area still working at full speed despite the war that had been hurting the nation for nearly 3 years. While other farmers had lost their workers to Union raids or army drafts, Silas Hargrove had managed to keep his business going through a mix of cruel rules and being far away from everyone else. The plantation house itself was a large two-story building with white columns that had turned gray from lack of care, the paint peeled off in long strips, showing wood that had turned dark from years of wet air and heat. 6 windows faced the front yard, their glass bent with age, showing twisted images of anyone who walked up. The roof dipped a little in the middle, and during heavy rain, water would drip through the ceiling of the second-floor hallway, making a steady sound that echoed through the empty rooms. Around the main house were the quarters, 23 small cabins set in 2 rows, each holding several families. The cabins were built of rough pine logs filled in with mud and moss that had to be fixed every spring. Each cabin measured about 12 by 14 feet and held anywhere from 4 to 8 people. There were no glass windows, only wooden covers that could be propped open during the day. The floors were packed dirt, and the roofs were made of wood shingles that leaked during storms. Past the quarters stood the cotton fields stretching toward a line of pine trees that marked the edge of Hargrove land. There were 300 acres of cotton, though only about 200 were being used by 1863. The dirt was red clay, hard to work with, and the crops had been getting smaller for years. But Silas refused to admit the drop, writing in his books that the land was as good as it had been in his father's time. Between the fields and the quarters stood the work buildings, a cotton machine house, a blacksmith shop, a wood shop, a smokehouse, and a large barn that stored tools and served as a place for punishment when Silas thought it was needed. The machine house was the biggest building on the property aside from the main house, a huge building with a dirt floor and giant wooden gears that pulled cotton fiber from the seed. The sound of the machine during harvest time was extremely loud, a constant grinding and clanking that could be heard for miles. Silas Hargrove was 47 years old in December of 1863. He stood just under 6 feet tall with a thin body that had grown thinner over the years. His hair, once dark brown, had turned mostly gray, and he wore it combed straight back from a high forehead. His face was sharp, with deep, set eyes that rarely looked directly at anyone. He had a habit of pressing his lips together when he was thinking, making deep lines around his mouth that made him look like he was always unhappy with something. Those who did business with him called him careful, cold, and obsessed with having control. He kept detailed records of everything: crop amounts, weather changes, money spent, and the names, ages, and guessed values of every enslaved person on his property. His record books filled a whole shelf in his office, each one marked by year and group. He would spend hours looking them over, making notes on the sides, guessing numbers for future harvests. But there was something else in those books, something that would not be found until after he died. Mixed in with the business notes were personal thoughts written in smaller, tighter handwriting, short notes about the people he enslaved. Ruth's boy Marcus shows skill for woodwork. Bess, age 4, sickly, might not live through winter. Thomas learning blacksmith trade, value going up. These were not kind notes. They were checks, the same way a farmer might note which animals were doing well and which were failing. Silas was raised to think slavery was normal, a money need, and a social setup ordered by God. His father, Nathaniel Hargrove, had owned the plantation before him and had taught Silas a strict way of seeing the world. There were those meant to lead and those meant to serve. Asking questions about this order was not only silly but dangerous. It threatened the whole base of their society. Nathaniel had died in 1856, leaving the plantation to Silas, his only living son. Silas's older brother, James, had been killed in a hunting accident in 1849, and his younger brother, Robert, had died of yellow fever in 1852. This left Silas as the only heir, a duty he took very seriously. Silas had married in 1851 at the age of 35 to a woman named Catherine Brennan, the daughter of a rich merchant in Savannah. It was not for love, but a practical deal. Catherine brought a lot of money, and Silas provided social rank and land. They had 4 children quickly, 2 sons, William and Charles, and 2 daughters, Margaret and Anne. Catherine was a quiet woman, very religious, who spent most of her time in the upstairs rooms of the house, reading the Bible and writing letters to her family in Savannah. She rarely went into the fields or the quarters, and she never questioned Silas's running of the plantation. But those who knew her said she seemed always sad, as if she carried a weight she could not name. In 1859, Catherine became pregnant with their 5th child. The pregnancy was hard from the start. She was weak, often in bed, and by the 8th month, it was clear something was wrong. On a cold night in November, she went into labor. The baby, a boy, was born dead. Catherine bled too much and died 3 hours later at the age of 32. Silas had her buried in the family graveyard, a small spot on a hill looking over the cotton fields. He paid for a stone with her name, dates, and a single line from the Bible. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. He never visited the grave after the funeral. The children were sent to live with Catherine's sister in Savannah shortly after their mother's death. Silas told people it was for their schooling and safety, but those close to the family guessed the real reason. He could not stand to look at them. They reminded him of Catherine, and Catherine reminded him of failure. He had failed to keep her safe, failed to give her a happy life, failed to be anything more than a cold, distant husband. With the children gone, Silas went further into his work. He spent 18 hours a day managing the plantation, checking books, planting crops, and keeping the strict control that defined his life. He ate alone, slept alone, and spoke only when needed. The enslaved families learned to avoid him when possible, to move quietly when he was near, to never meet his eyes. His only regular friend was Dutch Keller, the boss of the workers. Dutch was a big man, over 6 feet tall and very strong, with a thick red beard and small, cold eyes. He had worked on the plantation since 1857, hired by Silas's father shortly before Nathaniel's death. Dutch was fast, cruel when he thought it was needed, and totally loyal to Silas. He lived in a small house near the machine, separate from both the main house and the quarters, a physical sign of his place, above the enslaved, but below the master. Dutch handled the daily work of the plantation, giving out tasks, handing out food, keeping rules. Silas trusted him completely, perhaps because Dutch never questioned orders and never showed any sign of feeling bad about the nature of their work. To Dutch, enslaved people were tools, no different than plows or cotton machines. You kept them working, you used them, and when they broke, you replaced them. The winter of 1863 had been very hard. Frost came early in November, killing the last of the cotton plants before they could be picked. By December, the ground was hard and tough, and a thin layer of ice formed on the water barrels each morning. The enslaved families huddled in their cabins at night, burning what little wood they were given, trying to keep warm in houses that were never made for comfort. The cotton harvest had been the worst in 10 years. Silas figured that he had lost nearly 40% of what he expected to get. The bundles that were harvested were poor quality, getting lower prices at the market, and the market itself was a mess. The Confederate dollar was nearly worthless. Prices were going up fast, and people he owed money to were demanding payment in gold or goods. Silas was facing debts he could not ignore. He owed $3,200 to a bank in Savannah, $1,800 to a cotton seller in Macon, and another $2,000 to various sellers who had provided seeds, tools, and other needs on credit. In total, he was nearly $7,000 in debt with no clear way to pay. He spent the first 2 weeks of December looking at his choices. He could sell land, but land prices had crashed due to the war. He could sell tools, but he needed the tools to work. He could lower his number of workers, but he was already working at minimum levels. And then, on December 15th, he received a letter from Virgil Tate. Tate was a slave trader based in Macon, one of the few still working in Georgia in 1863. Most of the slave trade had collapsed due to the war, but Tate had found a special market, supplying labor to plantations in the Deep South that had missed the worst of the fighting. He focused on what he called future investments, young slaves who could be trained for specific tasks and would give decades of work. The letter was short and business-like. Tate had heard that Silas was facing money trouble. He was ready to make a good offer for young slaves, ages 4 to 14, paid in gold. He would take as many as Silas was willing to sell, no questions asked, with payment when they were picked up. Silas read the letter 3 times. He sat in his office, staring at the words, doing math in his head. 12 children. If he sold 12 at an average price of $700 each, he would have $8,400, enough to pay all his debts and have money left over for seeds and supplies for the spring planting. He told himself it was business, just business. The children were eating food the plantation could not spare. They would not be helpful for years. Their parents would have more children. It was a practical choice, a needed choice. It was what his father would have done. He wrote back to Virgil Tate that same evening, agreeing to the sale, 12 children ages 4 to 14, to be picked up on December 25th, Christmas Day, payment in gold upon arrival. He closed the letter and gave it to Dutch to mail the next morning. Then he poured himself a glass of whiskey and went back to his books, trying to ignore the small, nagging voice in the back of his mind that whispered he was making a mistake. The choosing process began on December 18th, exactly 1 week before Christmas. Silas woke before the sun came up, as he always did, and spent an hour in his office checking the plantation records. He had a list of all the children on the property, 37 in total, ranging in age from babies to 16-year-olds. He needed to choose 12. The rules were simple. They had to be healthy, between 4 and 14 years old, and from families that would not cause too much trouble. Silas knew that selling children would cause sadness and anger, but he guessed that some families would be easier to handle than others. Families with many children would be less crushed by the loss of one. Families with strong fathers might fight back, so he would avoid taking their children if possible. He made his first choices on paper, writing 12 names in his book. Then he called for Dutch. Dutch arrived at the office just after sunrise, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Silas showed him the list and explained the plan. Dutch listened without showing any feeling, then nodded. "When do you want to tell them?" Dutch asked. "Christmas Eve," Silas said. "No point in giving them time to make trouble." "They will make trouble anyway," Dutch said. "You are taking their children." "Then we will deal with it," Silas said. "But the sale is happening. Tate will be here Christmas morning with the gold." Dutch nodded again and left. Silas sat alone in his office, staring at the list of names. 12 children, 12 lives that would be moved, taken from their families, sold to strangers. He felt a flash of something, not quite guilt, but worry. He pushed it down and went back to his math. Over the next 2 days, Silas walked through the quarters and the work areas, watching the children on his list. He watched them play, work, talk with their families. He was looking for signs of sickness, weakness, or bad behavior that might lower their value. The first child on his list was Bess, a 4-year-old girl who lived with her mother, Sarah, and 2 older siblings in cabin number 7. Bess was small for her age, with large, dark eyes and a quiet way about her. She rarely spoke even to other children and spent most of her time holding onto her mother's dress. Silas noted that she looked healthy despite her size, and her youth made her valuable. She could be trained for housework and would provide decades of service. The second was Marcus, a 6-year-old boy who lived with his mother, Ruth, and his grandmother in cabin number 12. Marcus was full of energy and curious, always asking questions, always looking around. Ruth was a strong woman, one of the best workers on the plantation, and Silas knew that taking her son would break her. But Marcus was healthy, smart, and would bring a good price. The third was a girl named Lily, age 7, who lived with her parents and 3 younger siblings in cabin number 3. Lily helped her mother with the younger children and was already learning to sew and cook. She was quiet and followed rules, traits that would make her valuable in a house. The fourth was a boy named Samuel, age 8, who lived with his father, a blacksmith named Joseph, and his mother in cabin number 15. Samuel was learning with his father, learning the trade, and showed good skill for his age. Silas paused on this one. Joseph was a strong, respected man in the enslaved group, and taking his son might cause a fight. But Samuel's skills made him valuable, and Silas decided the risk was worth it. The fifth was a girl named Grace, age 9, who lived with her mother and 2 sisters in cabin number 8. Grace was tall for her age, strong, and already working in the fields with the adults. She rarely smiled, and there was a hardness in her eyes that Silas found troubling. But she was healthy and able, and that was all that mattered. The sixth was a boy named Daniel, age 10, who lived with his parents and an older brother in cabin number 19. Daniel was small and thin with quick hands and a sharp mind. He had been helping in the wood shop and showed skill for detailed work. His parents were quiet, unlikely to cause trouble, which made him a safe choice. The seventh was a girl named Hannah, aged 10, who lived with her mother and grandmother in cabin number 5. Hannah was happy and talked a lot, always singing while she worked. Her mother, a woman named Esther, was one of the house servants, which meant Hannah had been around housework from a young age. She would be easy to train and valuable in a household. The eighth was a boy named Isaac, age 11, who lived with his parents and 3 younger siblings in cabin number 21. Isaac was serious and responsible, often taking care of his younger siblings while his parents worked. He could read. His mother had secretly taught him to read using a Bible she had hidden. Though Silas did not know this, Isaac's smarts and maturity made him valuable. The ninth was a girl named Abigail, age 12, who lived with her mother and 2 younger brothers in cabin number 9. Abigail was beautiful with fine features and a graceful way of moving. Silas knew that her looks would make her valuable, though he did not allow himself to think too deeply about why. She was quiet and followed orders, unlikely to cause trouble. The 10th was a boy named Elijah, age 12, who lived with his parents and an older sister in cabin number 14. Elijah was strong and hardworking, already doing a full day's work in the fields. He rarely spoke, keeping his thoughts to himself, but there was a fire in his eyes that made Silas uncomfortable. Still, his strength and work ethic made him valuable. The 11th was a girl named Rebecca, age 13, who lived with her mother and younger sister in cabin number 6. Rebecca was good at sewing and cooking, and she helped care for younger children in the quarters. She was grown up for her age with a quiet pride that set her apart. Her mother was a widow, which meant there would be no father to cause trouble. The 12th was Thomas, age 14, who lived with his parents in cabin number 17. Thomas was the oldest on the list, nearly a man, and he had been learning with the plantation blacksmith for 3 years. He was skilled, strong, and smart. He was also the most likely to fight back, but his value was too high to pass up. 12 children, 4 girls, 8 boys, ages 4 to 14. Silas wrote their names in his book in neat, exact handwriting along with guest values based on age, health, and skills. The total came to $8,400, exactly what Virgil Tate had agreed to pay. Silas closed the book and locked it in his desk drawer. The choice was done. Now he just had to wait until Christmas Eve to make the announcement. The week leading up to Christmas was unusually quiet on the Hargrove plantation. The weather stayed bitterly cold with temperatures dropping below freezing each night. A thin layer of snow fell on December 20th, unusual for southern Georgia, and it stayed on the ground for 2 days before melting into muddy slush. The enslaved families went about their work with the same speed as always, but there was a tension in the air that even Silas noticed. People spoke in whispers. Children played more quietly than usual. There were no songs in the fields, no laughter in the quarters. It was as if everyone sensed that something was coming, though they did not know what. Silas spent most of his time in his office, checking his money records and preparing for the deal. He had written to the people he owed money to, telling them that he would be able to make payments in January. He had figured out how much gold he would need to set aside for spring planting. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail, but he could not shake a growing feeling of worry. It started as a small, nagging feeling in the back of his mind, easy to ignore. But as Christmas got closer, it grew stronger, more demanding. He found himself thinking about the children, not as things or investments, but as people. He remembered watching Bess hold onto her mother's dress. He remembered Marcus's endless questions. He remembered the way Thomas had looked at him once with a look Silas could not quite understand. He told himself he was being foolish. This was business. He had made the right decision. The plantation would survive because of this sale. That was all that mattered. On December 22nd, Dutch came to the office with a worry. Several of the enslaved families had been asking about Christmas. Usually, Christmas was one of the few days when they were given a break from work and allowed to celebrate with extra food and small gifts. They wanted to know if the tradition would continue this year. Silas thought about the question. Part of him wanted to cancel the celebration entirely. It seemed wrong to give them a day of rest when he was about to sell 12 of their children. But he also knew that canceling Christmas would raise doubts and might cause fights before the sale could be finished. "Tell them Christmas will be observed as usual," Silas said. "Extra food on Christmas Eve. No work on Christmas Day." Dutch nodded and left. Silas returned to his books, but he could not focus. He kept thinking about the announcement he would have to make on Christmas Eve. He imagined the mothers' faces when they heard their children's names. He imagined the father's anger. He imagined the children's confusion and fear. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, even though it was only afternoon, then another. By evening, he had finished half the bottle and fallen asleep at his desk. He dreamed of Catherine. She was standing in the upstairs hallway of the house wearing the white dress she had been buried in. She was looking at him with a look of deep sadness, and she was holding a baby, the dead son who had killed her. She did not speak, but her eyes said everything. "What have you become?" Silas woke with a jump, his heart pounding. The office was dark, the fire in the fireplace reduced to glowing coals. He lit a lamp and checked his pocket watch. It was just after midnight, December 23rd, 2 days until the sale. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quarters. A few cabins had lights in the windows, candles or small fires. Most were dark. He wondered if the families were sleeping or if they were lying awake, sensing the coming storm. He turned away from the window and went upstairs to his bedroom. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. December 23rd passed slowly. Silas stayed in his office, avoiding the quarters, avoiding Dutch, avoiding everyone. He reviewed the sale papers Virgil Tate had sent, making sure everything was correct. He counted and recounted the guest value of the children. He tried to focus on the numbers, the logic, the need for what he was doing, but the worry would not leave him. It had grown into something more than discomfort. It was a physical feeling, a tightness in his chest, a weight pressing down on him. He found it difficult to breathe. His hands shook when he tried to write. He could not eat. That evening, he walked out to the family graveyard on the hill. He had not been there since Catherine's funeral 4 years earlier. The stone was worn, but still readable. He stood in front of it, staring at the writing, and tried to remember what it had felt like to care about someone. He could not. That part of him seemed to have died with Catherine, or perhaps even before. He had spent so many years viewing people as assets, as tools, as numbers in a book that he had forgotten how to see them as anything else. He returned to the house as darkness fell. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Tomorrow he would make the announcement, and the day after the children would be gone, and he would have his gold, and everything would go back to normal. He almost believed it. December 24th, 1008. 163 dawned cold and gray. The sky was cloudy, threatening more snow, and a bitter wind blew from the north. Silas woke early as always, but he did not go to his office. Instead, he stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the quarters, watching as smoke began to rise from the chimneys as families woke and started their fires. He knew what he had to do today. He had practiced the words in his mind 100 times. He would be short, direct, without emotion. He would read the names from his book. He would tell them the children would be leaving at dawn. He would make it clear that fighting back would be punished. It would take 5 minutes, maybe less, and then it would be done. But as he stood at the window, watching the plantation wake up, he felt something he had not felt in years. Fear. Not fear of the enslaved family's reaction, though that was a worry, but a deeper fear, a deep dread that he could not name or explain. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send him falling into darkness. He pushed the feeling down and got dressed. He went to his office and got the book with the 12 names. He called for Dutch and told him to gather everyone in the yard at sunset for the food giving. Dutch nodded and left without comment. The day passed with painful slowness. Silas tried to work, but he could not focus. He tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. He tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. He spent most of the day sitting in his office, staring at the book, waiting for sunset. In the quarters, the families prepared for Christmas. Despite the cold and the hardships of the past year, there was a sense of waiting for something good. Christmas was one of the few days when they were allowed to rest, to be with their families, to pretend for just a moment that they were something more than property. The mothers cooked what little extra food they had been given. The fathers told stories to their children. The older children helped care for the younger ones. There was singing in some of the cabins, songs that had been passed down through generations. Ruth, Marcus's mother, held her son close as she prepared their small Christmas meal. Marcus was excited, chatting about what he hoped to get. Maybe an extra piece of cornbread or a small toy carved from wood. Ruth smiled and touched his hair, trying to memorize the feel of him, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his small body against hers. She did not know why, but she had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. She had felt it for days, a growing dread that she could not shake. She had dreamed the night before of Marcus walking away from her into darkness, and no matter how loudly she called, he did not turn back. She held him tighter and whispered a prayer. As sunset approached, Dutch walked through the quarters, calling for everyone to gather in the yard for food. The families came out of their cabins, wrapped up against the cold, and gathered in front of the big house. There were 63 people in total, men, women, and children, representing 23 families. Silas stood on the porch, the book in his hands. Dutch stood beside him, his face showing nothing. The enslaved families waited in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. Silas opened the book. His hands were shaking, and he held the book tighter to steady them. He looked out at the faces he had seen every day for years, faces he had never truly looked at. "I have an announcement," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin and far away. The crowd waited. Silas looked down at the book and began to read the names: Bess, Marcus, Lily, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, Hannah, Isaac, Abigail, Elijah, Rebecca, Thomas. 12 names. As each name was called, a wave of confusion passed through the crowd. Parents looked at each other trying to understand. Children looked up at their mothers and fathers, sensing something was wrong. "These children have been sold," Silas continued, his voice flat. "They will be leaving at dawn tomorrow. The buyer will arrive with a wagon. The deal is final. Anyone who gets in the way will be punished." For a moment there was total silence. The words hung in the cold air, impossible to understand, and then slowly the meaning sank in. The first sound was a gasp, a sharp breath from one of the mothers. Then another, and then the crying began. It started with Ruth. She let out a sound that was barely human, a cry of sadness so deep that it seemed to tear the air itself. She fell to her knees, holding Marcus to her chest, and the sound that came from her was the sound of a soul breaking. Other mothers joined her. Sarah, Bess's mother, collapsed, her body shaking with sobs. Esther, Hannah's mother, screamed and reached for her daughter, pulling her close. The fathers stood stiff, their faces like stone, their hands closed tight at their sides. The children began to cry, not understanding what was happening, but sensing their parents' terror. Bess held onto her mother, her small body shaking. Marcus buried his face in Ruth's shoulder. Thomas stood apart from his parents, his face blank, his eyes fixed on Silas. Ruth crawled forward on her knees, her hands reached out, her face wet with tears. She reached the porch steps and looked up at Silas, her voice breaking. "Please," she said. "Please, Master Hargrove, do not take my boy. He is all I have. Please, I will work harder. I will do anything. Please do not take him." Silas looked down at her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the total terror. He saw Marcus holding on to her, his small face pressed against her neck, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something crack inside him. But then he remembered the debts, the people he owed, the plantation, the need to survive. He hardened his face and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "He is worth more than you." Ruth's face fell. She let out another wail and collapsed onto the frozen ground, her body racked with sobs. Other mothers surged forward, begging, pleading, offering anything and everything if he would just spare their children. Silas turned and walked into the house. He locked the door behind him and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the sounds of sadness outside. The crying continued for hours, a sound so terrible that it seemed to seep into the walls of the house, into the very foundation. He went to his office and poured himself a glass of whiskey, then another. He tried to block out the sounds, but they followed him, echoing in his mind. He sat at his desk and stared at the book, at the 12 names written in his neat handwriting. Just business, he told himself. Just business, but the words felt empty. Outside in the quarters, the families held their children. They sang to them, whispered prayers, made promises they knew they could not keep. They tried to memorize every detail. The shape of their faces, the sound of their voices, the feel of their small hands. Ruth held Marcus all night, rocking him, singing softly. Marcus had stopped crying and was quiet now, his small body warm against hers. She whispered to him about how much she loved him, about how he needed to be strong, about how she would never forget him. "Will I see you again, Mama?" Marcus asked, his voice small. Ruth could not answer. She just held him tighter and continued to sing. In cabin number 17, Thomas sat with his parents. His father, a strong man named Jacob, had his hand on Thomas's shoulder. His mother, a woman named Miriam, held his hand. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Thomas looked at his parents and felt something harden inside him. He was 14 years old, nearly a man, and he understood what was happening in a way the younger children did not. He understood that tomorrow he would be taken from his family and sold to a stranger. He understood that he would likely never see his parents again. He understood that his life, his future, his very self was being erased because a white man needed money. And he understood that there was nothing he could do about it. But as he sat there holding his mother's hand, feeling his father's grip on his shoulder, he made a silent promise. He would survive. He would remember. And someday, somehow, he would make sure that what was being done to him and the other children would not be forgotten. The night deepened, the temperature dropped, the crying in the quarters slowly turned into quiet sobbing and then into silence. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of sadness too deep for words, of hearts breaking in the darkness. In the big house, Silas sat alone in his office. He had finished the bottle of whiskey and started another. His mind was foggy, his thoughts mixed up. He kept seeing Ruth's face, hearing her voice. "Please don't take my boy." He stood and walked to the window. The quarters were dark now, no lights in the windows. He wondered if anyone was sleeping or if they were all lying awake, holding their children, counting down the hours until dawn. He turned away from the window and was about to return to his desk when he heard it. A knock at the door, 3 soft, deliberate taps. Silas froze. It was just after midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? He assumed it was Dutch, perhaps with news about the arrival time or a worry about fighting back. He walked through the dark hallway to the front door and opened it. No one was there. The porch was empty. The yard beyond was still, lit by a half-moon that cast long shadows across the frozen ground. Silas stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked left, then right. Nothing. He was about to go back inside when he saw them. 12 figures standing at the edge of the yard where the grass met the dirt path leading to the quarters. Small figures, children. For a moment, Silas thought the enslaved families had sent the children to beg for themselves. He felt a rush of anger. This was a trick, an attempt to make him feel guilt. He stepped off the porch and started toward them, ready to send them back and punish whoever had planned this. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The children were not moving. They stood perfectly still, set in a line, their faces tilted upward toward the house. And they were silent, completely unnaturally silent. No crying, no begging, no sound at all. "Get back to the quarters," Silas said, his voice sharp. Now none of them moved. He was 10 feet away when he recognized them. Bess, the 4-year-old, her small body stiff. Marcus, Ruth's son, his face blank. Thomas, the blacksmith's helper, his eyes fixed on Silas. All 12 children from the list, standing in the exact order he had written their names in the book. "I said get back," Silas repeated, louder now. His voice echoed in the stillness. The children did not respond. They did not blink. They simply stared at him with looks he could not read. Not fear, not anger, but something else. Something that made his skin crawl despite the cold. And then slowly they began to move. Not toward him, not away. They simply turned together perfectly and started walking toward the cotton fields. Silas stood frozen, watching them disappear into the darkness beyond the reach of the moonlight. His heart was pounding, though he could not explain why. They were just children, enslaved children who would be gone by noon tomorrow. This changed nothing. But as he stood there in the cold, watching the darkness where they had vanished, he felt that fear again, the deep dread that had been growing all day. It was stronger now, almost overwhelming. He went back inside, locked the door, and returned to his office. He poured another glass of whiskey and tried to steady his shaking hands. Just children, he told himself, just a trick to make me feel guilty. It won't work. But he could not shake the image of their faces, the way they had stared at him, the total silence, the way they had moved together perfectly, as if controlled by a single mind. He tried to return to his book, but the numbers blurred. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw them standing in that line, their small bodies stiff, their eyes fixed on him. At 2:00 in the morning, he heard singing. If you are feeling the weight of this story, imagine how those families felt on that Christmas Eve. Before we go on to the most scary part of this night, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who likes true history mysteries. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Now, let's discover what happened when Silas heard that singing in the darkness. The singing was faint at first, barely able to be heard over the wind that rattled the windows of the big house. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A tune that Silas did not recognize, sung in voices too young to carry such weight. The tune was slow, sad, with a beat that felt wrong, strange, like a church song sung backward, or a lullaby twisted into something dark. Silas stood in his office, the whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. He listened, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to float through the walls like smoke, seeping into every corner of the house. He went to the window and looked out. The yard was empty. The quarters were dark, but the singing continued, rising and falling in waves that made his chest tighten. He grabbed his coat and a light and went outside. The moment he stepped off the porch, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was total and heavy, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of animals in the woods, no sound of trees or rustling of leaves, just silence, so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He held the light high and walked toward the quarters. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, each step unusually loud in the stillness. He expected to find the families awake, perhaps gathered in one of the cabins, perhaps singing to comfort themselves. But every door was closed, every window dark. He knocked on the nearest door, Cabin number 7, where Bess lived with her mother Sarah. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. He pushed the door open. Inside, Sarah lay on a bed with her 2 older children, all 3 of them asleep. But it was not a normal sleep. Their breathing was shallow, almost hard to see, and they did not move when Silas called out. He moved closer and shook Sarah's shoulder. She did not wake. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady, but she was completely unresponsive, as if trapped in some deep, strange sleep. Silas backed out of the cabin, his heart racing. He moved to the next cabin, then the next, the same in each one. Every adult, every child except the 12 he had chosen, was asleep in this same deep, strange way. He called their names, shook them, even splashed water on their faces. Nothing worked. They simply lay there breathing shallowly, trapped in sleep, except the 12 children. The 12 children were gone. Silas felt the first real bit of panic. He told himself it was silly. They were hiding, playing some kind of game. Or perhaps their parents had hidden them before falling into this strange sleep. But the panic remained, cold and insistent, spreading through his chest like ice water. He searched the quarters, the barn, the storage sheds, the machine house. Nothing. He walked to the edge of the cotton fields, holding his light high, and called their names. His voice was swallowed by the darkness, as if the night itself was eating the sound, and then he saw the light. Deep in the fields, perhaps 100 yards away, a small fire burned. It was low to the ground, flickering weakly but clear against the darkness. Silas started toward it, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, his breath coming in short gasps. As he got closer, he saw them. The 12 children sat in a perfect circle around the fire. They were not moving, were not speaking. They simply sat, their faces lit by the flames, staring into the fire as if in a trance. The light cast strange shadows on their faces, making them look older, almost ancient. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded, his voice breaking the silence. "Get up, get back to the quarters now." None of them looked at him. They continued to stare into the fire, their faces blank. He stepped closer, anger taking over fear. "I said, get up." One of the children, Thomas, the oldest, finally turned his head. His eyes met Silas's, and for the first time the boy spoke. "We are waiting." His voice was calm, almost like talking to a friend, but there was something underneath it that made Silas's skin crawl. Waiting for what? Silas snapped. Thomas did not answer right away. He simply looked at Silas with a look that was neither angry nor afraid. It was something else, something that looked almost like pity. "For you to see us," Thomas said quietly. "I see you," Silas said. "You are sitting in my field in the middle of the night." "Now get up before I know," Thomas interrupted. "You don't see us. You have never seen us, not really." Silas felt his anger spike. "I don't have time for this nonsense. Get up now." He reached down and grabbed Thomas's arm, intending to drag him to his feet. But the moment his hand made contact, Thomas looked up again. And this time, his look was different. Not blank, not empty, but filled with something Silas could not name. A depth of understanding that no 14-year-old should possess. "You sold us," Thomas said quietly, "on Christmas." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He let go of the boy's arm and stepped back. "It's business," Silas said, but his voice sounded weak, even to himself. "You don't understand. It's just business. I have debts. The plantation." "We understand," Thomas said, and then in a voice that did not sound like a 14-year-old boy, he added, "Do you?" The fire went out, not slowly, not flickering and fading. It simply vanished as if someone had thrown a blanket over it. The darkness rushed in, total and choking. Silas's light was still burning, but its light seemed to stop just inches from the glass, unable to break the blackness around him. He heard movement, footsteps, whispers. The children were standing now. He could sense it, but he could not see them. He swung the light wildly, trying to find them, but the light revealed nothing but darkness. And then he felt it. Hands, small hands, dozens of them touching him. Not grabbing, not violent, just touching his arms, his chest, his face, cold fingers pressing gently against his skin as if trying to memorize him, to understand him. Silas screamed. He swung the light and it broke against the ground, putting him into complete darkness. He ran blindly, stumbling over frozen ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He did not know which direction he was going. He only knew he had to get away. The hands followed him. They touched his back, his shoulders, his neck. Light touches, almost gentle but non-stop. And with each touch he felt something, a flash of feeling, a piece of memory that was not his own. He felt terror, the terror of a 4-year-old child being torn from her mother's arms. He felt confusion, the confusion of a 6-year-old boy who did not understand why he was being taken away. He felt grief. The grief of a mother watching her child disappear into darkness. He felt rage, the rage of a father who could not protect his family. He felt despair, the despair of children who had been told they were worthless, that they were property, that their lives had no value beyond what someone was willing to pay. Each emotion hit him like a wave, overwhelming, choking. He tried to push them away, to block them out, but they kept coming faster and faster until he could not tell where his own feelings ended and theirs began. He ran until his legs gave out and he collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping, his heart hammering in his chest. The hands were gone, the darkness was gone. He was lying in the yard in front of the big house, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. He opened his eyes and saw them, the 12 children standing on the porch watching him. They did not speak, they did not move, they simply stood there silent and still as the sun began to rise behind them. Silas staggered to his feet, his body shaking, his mind spinning. He stumbled into the house, locked the door, dragged a chair against it, and collapsed onto the floor of his office. His clothes were torn, his hands bleeding from where he had fallen. His face was wet, whether from tears or sweat or melted snow, he did not know. He sat there for a long time trying to make sense of what had happened. It was exhaustion, he told himself, stress, guilt turning into a vision. It was not real. It could not be real. But when he looked down at his hands, he saw the dirt under his nails, the scratches on his palms, and when he looked at the window, he saw them still standing there watching, and he knew with a certainty that terrified him that it had been real, all of it. At exactly 6:00 in the morning, Virgil Tate arrived with his wagon and 3 armed men. Silas heard the sound of horses and wheels on the frozen road and forced himself to stand. His body ached, his head pounded, and his hands would not stop shaking. He looked at himself in the mirror above his desk and barely recognized the man staring back. His face was pale, his eyes red and sunken, his hair messy. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. He straightened his clothes as best he could and walked to the front door. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and opened it. Virgil Tate was a large man, over 6 feet tall and heavily built, with a thick black beard and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a long coat and a wide hat, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had done this deal 100 times before. Behind him, 3 men sat on the wagon, all armed with rifles, all watching Silas with looks of bored uncaring. "Hargrove," Tate said, his voice gruff. "You have them ready." Silas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked past Tate to the yard where the 12 children still stood in a line, exactly as they had been, waiting. But something was different now. In the growing light of dawn, he could see their faces clearly, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. They were not blank anymore. They were not empty. Their eyes were filled with something he finally recognized, something he had been too blind to see before: humanity. They were children, just children, children who were terrified, confused, grieving. Children who had families, who had dreams, who had futures that were being stolen from them. Children who were exactly like his own sons and daughters, except for the color of their skin and the accident of their birth. And he was about to sell them on Christmas morning for gold. Well, Tate said impatiently, "Let's get it done. I have another stop in Thomasville." Silas looked at the children, at best the 4-year-old, her small body trembling. At Marcus, Ruth's son, his eyes wide with fear. At Thomas, the blacksmith's helper, who was looking at him with that same expression of understanding, of pity. And in that moment, Silas Hargrove understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They knew exactly what he was. They knew what he had chosen, and they knew that he would have to live with it. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. It pressed down on him, choking him. And he realized that this was what they had shown him in the darkness. Not revenge, not punishment, but truth. The simple, unbearable truth of what he was doing. He thought about the gold, about the debts, about the plantation, about everything he had told himself to explain this decision. And he realized that none of it mattered, none of it was worth this. "No," Silas said quietly. Tate frowned. "What? No," Silas repeated louder now. His voice was shaking, but there was a firmness underneath it that surprised even him. "The sale is off." Tate's face grew dark. "The hell it is. We have a contract. I have your signature. You take this gold, or I take those children, and you get nothing." Silas looked at the leather bag in Tate's hand. The bag holding $8,400 in gold coins, enough to save the plantation, enough to pay his debts, enough to secure his future. Then he looked at the children again, at their faces, at their eyes. "Take your gold and leave," Silas said. Tate stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight. "You are a fool, Hargrove. You will lose everything." "I know," Silas said, and he did. He knew that without the gold, he would fail to pay his debts. The people he owed would take the plantation. He would lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. He would be ruined, but he also knew that if he went through with this sale, he would lose something far more important. He would lose whatever remained of his humanity. He would become something he could never come back from. Tate spit on the ground. "Your funeral." He turned to his men. "Let's go. We are wasting time here." The wagon turned and started back down the road. The sound of horses and wheels faded into the morning. Silas stood on the porch watching them disappear and felt something inside him break and reform at the same time. He looked at the children. Slowly, one by one, they turned and walked back toward the quarters. By the time the sun was fully up, they were gone. Silas stood on the porch for a long time after the children left, staring at the empty yard. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the frozen ground, and the world was beginning to wake up. He could hear sounds from the quarters now, doors opening, voices calling out the normal sounds of morning. He realized that whatever had happened during the night, whatever strange sleep had fallen over the plantation was over. The families were waking up, and they would want answers. Silas went inside and walked to his office. He sat at his desk and stared at the book, at the 12 names written in his neat handwriting. He picked up his pen, dipped it in ink, and drew a single line through each name. Then at the bottom of the page, he wrote 3 words. "Sale cancelled, debt remains." He closed the book and locked it in his desk drawer. Then he stood and walked back outside. The families were coming out of the quarters now, confused and mixed up. They had woken to find themselves in their cabins with no memory of how they got there or what had happened during the night. The last thing they remembered was the announcement on Christmas Eve. The sadness, the crying, the terror of knowing their children would be taken at dawn. But dawn had come and their children were still there. Ruth was the first to see Marcus. He was standing outside their cabin, looking tired and confused but unharmed. She ran to him and swept him into her arms, sobbing, checking him for injuries, unable to believe he was really there. Other mothers did the same. finding their children, holding them, weeping with relief and confusion. The children could not explain what had happened. They remembered standing in the yard, remembered walking to the fields, remembered sitting around a fire, but after that, everything was blank until they woke up at dawn. Dutch Keller came out of his house near the machine, looking as confused as everyone else. He had fallen asleep at his desk the night before and woken to find it was Christmas morning. He walked to the big house and found Silas standing on the porch. "What happened?" Dutch asked. "Where is Tate? Did the sale go through?" "No," Silas said. "I canceled it." Dutch stared at him. "You what?" "I canceled the sale," Silas repeated. "The children are staying, but the debts—" "I will figure it out," Silas said. His voice was flat, without emotion. But there was a finality to it that made Dutch realize there was no point in arguing. Dutch shook his head. "You have lost your mind." "Maybe," Silas said, "or maybe I just found it." Dutch left, whispering under his breath. Silas remained on the porch, watching as the families slowly realized what had happened. The children were not being taken. They were safe. It was Christmas morning, and they were still together. The relief was clear, but so was the confusion. No one understood what had changed. No one knew why Silas had canceled the sale, and no one dared to ask. Silas spent the rest of Christmas Day alone in his office. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He simply sat at his desk, staring at the book, replaying the events of the night over and over in his mind. The children in the yard, the fire in the fields, the hands in the darkness, the emotions that had overwhelmed him. Terror, confusion, sadness, rage, despair. He had felt what they felt. He had experienced for just a moment what it was like to be them, to be powerless, to be property, to be seen as less than human, and it had broken something in him that could never be repaired. The days following Christmas of 1863 were marked by a strange, heavy silence on the Hargrove plantation. The enslaved families returned to their work, but something had changed. They moved through their tasks with the same speed, but there was a new feeling to their presence, a quiet pride, a sense of having seen something that could not be undone. Silas Hargrove did not leave the big house for 3 days. Dutch Keller tried to speak with him on December 27th, knocking on the office door and asking about the plantation's work. Silas did not respond. Dutch could hear him inside moving around, but the door remained locked. On the 28th, Dutch left a tray of food outside the door. It sat there untouched until the 29th, when Silas finally came out. Those who saw him said he looked like he had aged 10 years. His face was thin, his eyes sunken and red, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights. His hands shook when he tried to hold a pen. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost weight in just a few days. He did not speak to anyone. He simply walked through the plantation, stopping sometimes to stare at the quarters, the fields, the places where the children played. On December 30th, he did something never done before. He called a meeting of all the enslaved families. They gathered in the yard, tired and unsure. The last time they had been called together, Silas had announced the sale of their children. They did not know what to expect now, but they prepared for the worst. Silas stood on the porch, the same spot where he had made the announcement 6 days earlier, but this time everything about him was different. His body was less stiff, his voice was quieter, and when he spoke, there was something in his tone that none of them had ever heard before. Uncertainty, humbleness, perhaps even shame. "I am giving you a choice," he said. The families looked at each other, confused. Enslaved people did not get choices. "Anyone who wants to leave can leave," Silas continued. His voice was steady, but there was an emotion under it that threatened to break through. I won't stop you. I will give you papers saying you are free. You can go north, find the Union lines, start over. Anyone who wants to stay can stay. I will pay wages, not much, but something. Real money, not fake money. And the children, he paused, his voice catching. The children will go to school. I will hire a teacher. They will learn to read and write. The silence that followed was deep. No one moved, no one spoke. They simply stared at him, trying to understand if this was real or another cruel trick. I know you don't trust me, Silas said, and for the first time his voice broke slightly. I don't blame you. I have given you no reason to trust me, but I am telling you the truth. You are free to choose, and whatever you decide, I won't punish you for it. He turned and went back inside, leaving them standing in the yard, stunned. Over the next week, the families discussed what to do. Some were suspicious, believing this was a trap. Others were cautiously hopeful. A few were simply too tired to care. They had survived this long, and they would continue to survive whatever Silas's reasons might be. In the end, 11 families left. They packed what little they had, a few clothes, some cooking tools, blankets, and walked north toward the promise of Union protection. It was winter. The roads were dangerous, and they had no guarantee of safety. But they chose to take the risk rather than stay on a plantation where they had been treated as property for so long. 12 families stayed, not because they trusted Silas, but because they had nowhere else to go. Winter was brutal for those without shelter, and the roads were full of Confederate patrols who would capture and re-enslave any black person without papers. Staying was the practical choice, even if it meant remaining in a place filled with painful memories. Silas kept his word. In early January, he hired a teacher, a widow from Valdosta named Mrs. Calloway. She was in her 50s, educated, and had been struggling to make ends meet since her husband's death. Silas offered her room and board, plus a small salary, to teach the children 3 times a week. Mrs. Calloway was unsure at first. She had heard stories about Silas Hargrove, about his coldness and his reputation as a harsh master. But when she arrived at the plantation and saw the children, saw their eagerness to learn, their bright eyes and quick minds, she agreed to take the job. She set up a small schoolroom in one of the unused storage buildings. She taught reading, writing, math, and history. The children were hungry for knowledge, taking in everything she taught them with an intensity that moved her to tears. Thomas, the 14-year-old blacksmith's helper, was her best student. He could already read a little. His mother had secretly taught him using a Bible, and he quickly moved past the basics. Within weeks, he was reading at a level that would have been impressive for any child his age, enslaved or free. Silas also began paying wages. They were small, just a few dollars a month per family, but they were paid in gold, not Confederate paper money. For people who had never been paid for their work, who had never had money of their own, it was a huge change. He stopped carrying a whip. He stopped entering the quarters uninvited. He stopped issuing punishments for small mistakes. The plantation continued to work, but the feeling had changed. There was less fear, less tension. People still worked hard, but they worked with a sense of purpose rather than terror. But Silas himself was changing in ways that went beyond rules. Those who watched him closely noticed that he seemed haunted. He would stop in the middle of a task and stare into the distance as if seeing something no one else could see. He would wake in the middle of the night and walk through the plantation, stopping at the edge of the cotton fields, staring into the darkness. He began going to church in Valdosta, sitting in the back row, never speaking to anyone. He would arrive just as the service started and leave the moment it ended, avoiding talking. But he listened closely to every sermon, especially those about forgiveness, making up for wrongs, and the weight of sin. Dutch Keller left in February of 1864. He told anyone who would listen that Silas had lost his mind. He is not the same man, Dutch wrote in a letter to his brother. Something broke in him that night. He walks around like a ghost, talking to himself, staring at nothing. He is paying them wages for God's sake, treating them like they are free. I can't work for a man like that. He is going to lose everything, and I won't be there to watch it happen. Dutch was right about one thing. Silas was losing everything. Without the gold from the sale, he could not pay his debts. The people he owed began sending increasingly threatening letters. The bank in Savannah filed a claim against the property. Sellers refused to give credit, but Silas did not seem to care. He continued to pay wages. He continued to fund the school. He continued to treat the people on his plantation as human beings rather than property. In March of 1864, he did something even more unusual. He began writing letters to government officials arguing for the rights of enslaved people. He wrote to the governor of Georgia, to members of the Confederate Congress, to anyone who might listen. His letters were strong, detailed, and deeply personal. In one letter found years later in the state archives, he wrote, "I have spent my life believing that slavery was a natural order, a necessary system, a system ordered by God. I was wrong. I have seen the faces of children torn from their mothers. I have heard the cries of parents who know they will never see their sons and daughters again. I have felt for just a moment the terror and despair of those who are treated as property rather than people, and I can no longer stay silent. This system is evil. It destroys not only those who are enslaved, but also those who enslave. It ruins soul and blinds us to the humanity of our fellow man. I do not expect forgiveness for my role in keeping this evil going, but I can at least speak the truth even if no one listens." The letters were ignored. Some were mocked, a few resulted in threats, but Silas continued to write them, driven by a need he could not explain. The war dragged on through 1864 and into 1865. Sherman's army marched through Georgia in late 1864, burning plantations and freeing enslaved people in their path. The Hargrove plantation was spared, likely because it was so isolated and appeared already abandoned. By the time Union soldiers reached the area, there was little left to burn. In April of 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the war officially ended. News traveled slowly to southern Georgia, but by late April, word had reached Valdosta. The Confederacy was dead. Slavery was ended. Silas gathered the remaining families and told them they were legally free now. He offered to let them stay and work for wages or leave with his blessing and whatever supplies he could spare. Most stayed, not out of loyalty to Silas, but out of practicality. The world outside was a mess. The roads were full of displaced people, both black and white. The economy had crashed. There were no jobs, no roads, no safety net. The plantation, for all its dark history, offered stability, but the relationship had changed. The families were no longer enslaved. They were workers, employees, people with choice, and Silas treated them as such. He began splitting the plantation land, offering plots to families who wanted to farm independently. He provided seeds, tools, and advice. He helped them set up their own small farms, even though it meant reducing the size of his own operation. In 1867, he sold most of the remaining plantation land to the families who had stayed, offering them terms so generous that a lawyer in Valdosta accused him of financial suicide. The lawyer was probably right. Silas sold the land for a tiny part of its value, accepting payment in parts over 10 years with no interest. "Why are you doing this?" the lawyer asked him. "You are giving away everything your family built." Silas looked at him with those haunted eyes and said, "Because it was never mine to begin with." He kept only the big house and a few acres around it. The rest, nearly 300 acres, was split among 12 families. 12 families for 12 children. It was not an accident. Silas lived alone in the big house, refusing to marry again or reconnect with his own children in Savannah. He wrote to them sometimes, but they rarely responded. They had built new lives, and Silas was a reminder of a past they wanted to forget. He spent his days reading, writing, and walking the fields. He continued to go to church, continued to write letters arguing for the rights of formerly enslaved people, continued to live with the weight of what he had done. And every Christmas Eve he would stand in the yard at midnight in the exact spot where he had seen the 12 children, and he would stay there until dawn. No one knew what he was doing. Some thought he was praying, others thought he was keeping watch. A few believed he was waiting for something or someone to return. Mrs. Calloway, who continued to teach at the school even after the war ended, once asked him about it. "Why do you stand out there every Christmas Eve?" she asked. Silas was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because I need to remember. Remember what I almost did, what I was, and what they showed me. The children," Silas nodded, "they did not curse me.